The World Economic Forum has just held its first World Economic Forum for the year. And as it is, as it is done every year, the World Economic Forum comes together to look at the global outlook and trade outlook for the year. And this year we had a Vice President, Kashim Shettima, represent Nigeria on the floor of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. We also did have Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, where she spoke extensively on how Nigeria can strengthen trade relations with global nations. And there were a lot of conversations around removal of trade sanctions amongst member nations, and how also issues around protectionism, border control, trade facilitation, and using AI to strengthen trade and business relations. And right about now, we'll just show you excerpts from that event. And after that, we'll come back to discuss a bit on these conversations around trade and just how much of an impact it would have on Nigeria and the African region. So take a listen.
Well, the next frontier, the next global frontier is Africa. And I can assure you that as the trajectory of global growth moves towards Africa, Nigeria will certainly play a very pivotal role. If Nigeria walks, Africa walks.
The fastest growing segment of trade is digitally delivered services trade, which is growing at 8% per annum. The other thing is green trade. We've seen a tripling in the value of green trade from 2000 to now to 1.9 trillion, and we think that dollars, and we think that there's the prospects for more are good. So whilst the forecast of 3.3% that we had made for this year, we're a little less optimistic because of all the disruptions, the Red Sea and disruptions, the Suez Canal, even the Panama Canal. We think, and the higher cost of trade that comes from all this does have a bearing. We may not come in at 3.3, maybe lower, but still, I think that is much better than the performance last year.
It's politically difficult to talk about raising taxes. It's also politically difficult to phase out subsidies. We tried it when I was a finance minister in Nigeria, and we wanted to phase out our subsidies. We went halfway, but it was very politically sensitive. So that is why you don't hear great enthusiasm when you talk about raising taxes or phasing out subsidies. But I think the world, we need to take some hard decisions. You cannot have a situation in which you have $1.2 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies. A lot of it is in developed countries, by the way, not developing. And then we are trying to look for peanuts for a loss and damage fund. You have over 600 billion in trade distorting agricultural subsidies. And we are looking for peanuts for a loss and damage fund. When we get 200 million, we're all happy. We need to take those hard decisions, but they are not being done because it's politically difficult, and politicians will look at the short-term horizon. They want to be re-elected, right? It is true that in 2023, trade was considerably down. Actually, goods trade, we had to revise our forecast down from 1.7% for the year to 0.8%. In the last quarter, as you said, we saw an uptick in the numbers, and trade showed a recovery led by automobiles and components and parts. But all in all, when we look at the first 3 quarters and the last quarter, we still think we'll come in at about the number we projected or slightly less than that. We had been more optimistic about 2024, and we were forecasting a considerable recovery to 3.3%. So, like Christine said, maybe moving towards normalization, or how you put it, but not normal. Because trade growth is still below trend, is still trending below GDP growth. But the problem that I have is the geopolitical conflicts that we now see, the problem in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. We also have problems in the Panama Canal because of climate change. There are so many uncertainties, and of course, all the elections that we see around the world and what that may bring. I think there are a lot of uncertainties that make forecasting difficult. However, I'll take a bit of a risk and say I think it will be better than 2023. It may not come in at 3.3%, below that, but much better than what we saw in 2023, unless a major war breaks out. Then all bets are off.
So thank you very much. I would like to flag a couple of areas where I think there can be hope and there can be trust if we deliver. And I'd like to start with two observations as a follow-up to Tarman. Your point is well taken about taxation, Tarman, but you have in this panel, in the discussion we're having, a good example of how difficult it is. Because tax issues present a huge heterogeneity. Whether you're sitting in one country or the other, you can have a tax burden of 50% of GDP or 10% of GDP. And you're starting from a completely different picture. So that should be taken into account. Second, there are currently instruments that have been laboriously negotiated at the OECD level to put in place those two pillars, one that institutes a minimum corporate taxation, and the other one that proposes to allocate profits of large corporates around the world on the basis of where the activity is generated. These agreements have been approved at the OECD level. They just need to be ratified. So it's there. Let's get on with it and move, because otherwise we will move to more fragmentation of tax, and we are seeing it with the carbon tax border adjustment here and there. And that would be more cacophony added to the risk that we see. And that takes me to my second area where I think there is hope if we... I'm sorry that Ngozi had to go because it touches on trade. Everybody will agree, no matter how much we talk about deglobalization, that globalization had massive positive impact in pulling people out of poverty, hundreds of millions. If we listen to Ajay Banga from the World Bank, this virtuous path on which we were heading is now at best stable, at worst declining. More poverty than less poverty. Well, if we look at trade and the decoupling or the de-risking, however we want to call it, it implies two things. One, there will be different and new sources of supply and new patterns of trade, number one. Number two, because there is more vulnerability associated with supply, it may well be that the cost will be higher in the long term. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe we've been relying on this principle of efficiency over security a little bit too much, assuming that everything had virtually no cost, assuming that labor cost had to be minimal and reduced over the course of time. Well, this can change, and maybe can change for the better, to bring those people who had the benefit of globalization and were taken out of poverty, also out of this recessing poverty that is at risk of bringing some of them back down again. So I see a lot of positives on those two fronts.
And this is more important than ever as we start 2024, the biggest electoral year in history. Democracies across the world will head to the polls, and half of the global population will be affected. This includes over 450 million people in the European Union, a union of 27 democracies, where all of us have the right to speak our mind, to be ourselves, even if we are different from the majority. In a democracy, it is the people, with their choices and behaviors, who pick winners and losers in the economic arena. Companies are free to compete. Change makers are free to innovate. Merit determines economic success. Russia is failing on strategic goals. It is first and foremost a military failure. We haven't forgotten that when Russia invaded Ukraine, many feared that Kyiv would fall in just a few days and the rest of the country within weeks. This did not happen. Instead, Russia has lost roughly half of its military capabilities. Ukraine has driven Russia out of half of the territories it had captured. Ukraine has pushed back Russia's Black Sea fleet and reopened a maritime corridor to deliver the grain to the world. And Ukraine has retained its freedom and its independence.
Well, the next frontier, the next global frontier is Africa. And I can assure you that as the trajectory of global growth moves towards Africa, Nigeria will certainly play a very pivotal role. If Nigeria walks, Africa walks. Our combined GDP is expected to be about 3.4 trillion US dollars with a market of 1.3 billion people. And the beauty of the African continent, besides the tremendous natural resource endowments, the most important of our endowments are the human resource component. We are the youngest continent in the world. For instance, Nigeria, the average age of the Nigerian population is 19.
Well, in the words of a vice president, if Nigeria works, Africa works. There are little excerpts there from the just concluded World Economic Forum that held in Davos, Switzerland. I'll just begin by talking a bit on the major points that the Vice President Kashim Shettima made, where he talked about Nigeria and the GDP growth that has been recorded a lot recently. He spoke extensively to issues around just how much Nigeria plays a pivotal role within the African space. You know, one thing that our president has said over and over again is the fact that Nigeria is ready for business, and he's just re-echoing what the president has said over time as to how much foreign direct investment Nigeria can attract if the right investment and trade relations are made. He also talked about, you know, growing very substantial, strong trade relations away from, you know, mere saying or mere just signing papers and signing agreements to doing the actual thing. And he also spoke extensively as to how Nigeria was moving away from, you know, using fossil fuels to renewable energy, which is a major conversation around global forums like this. And one of those is, you know, moving away from fossil fuels to using renewable energy. And he talked about Nigeria's net zero decision, which we do expect to reach by the year 2050. How far can Nigeria come with regards to that? Well, we'll watch to see just what we can do regarding that. And away from that now, we also did show you excerpts from the speech by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is the Director General of the World Trade Organization, where she spoke to issues around trade. And one thing she did say over and over again was the issue around protectionism that we've witnessed play out within, you know, major nations such as China and the USA, you know, trade sanctions, you know, hampering strong trade relations amongst regions, and that has played out a lot lately. And we're starting to see that play out even in the area of countries taking sides between Ukraine and Russia, such as major sanctions being given to Russia with regards to power and energy, and even conversations around oil production. Many nations, you know, moving away from having power relations with Russia particularly, and even some also moving away from relations with Ukraine. So she talked extensively on that and how nations can reduce heavy taxations that have been witnessed over time. As you know, the year 2020 was quite exceptional, I should say, with the many countries grappling with the effect of COVID-19. And most countries are trying to go back to the pre-pandemic levels, and we're seeing harsh sanctions being put in place. So she spoke about that as well, and how it is important at this point that countries across the world, you know, could have proper relations, have strengthened business relations away from just, doing it for mercy or just doing it for the benefits that they can have as a nation. But she also talked about globalization, how globalization is able to, take out most people away from poverty. And we've seen that play out a lot recently. We also did bring you excerpts from Christine Lagarde, who is the president of the European Central Bank, where she talked about interest hikes and all of those. And we also did bring you excerpt on Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. She talked about issues with regards to trade and how much the war within Russia and Ukraine have impacted trade within the region. Unfortunately, our time is fast spent, and that's the much that we can take on today's edition of the program. But tremendous, very important discussions that were made at the World Economic Forum. We hope to see how much of an effect those conversations will have, not just within Nigeria, but across the African region. And this is the point where we draw the curtains on today's edition of the program. My name is Chiamaka Nendu. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.